We've reviewed the idea of economies of scale, but why are they a barrier to entry? One argument is that firms that are already in the market, we could call them incumbent firms, could be there supplying market demand at a relatively low cost per unit. So if existing firms have exploited economies of scale, they could be having relatively low average costs. If a new firm is going to enter the market, and if it's going to be at least small initially, it would experience higher average costs. So it wouldn't be able to price its product competitively and still cover its costs. That does make the assumption that new firms are using the same technology as existing firms, and so they would face essentially the same costs. And it's also assuming that the new firm is selling a product that's a very close substitute for what existing firms are producing, and therefore it would essentially have to match their prices. If it were the case that a new firm was selling a product that was significantly different in some way, in other words, if its product was quite differentiated from that was in the market at the present time, it's possible that they could charge a higher price and still have customers. They could still have some share of the market. It's also possible that if economies of scale are the result of some high fixed costs that have to be incurred if you're going to produce anything, then any new firm would have to make a relatively large investment to cover those high fixed costs. That investment would have to be financed in some way, and if the firm's prospects were uncertain, if they were risky, it might be difficult to find that finance. Now, if profits are quite attractive in this industry, there's no reason really why finding finance should be a big problem. There could also be large firms around that would have the resources to enter this market if it seemed profitable, but perhaps there might not be many large firms that would be in a position to do so. So it can be argued that high fixed costs are possibly a barrier to entry, especially in the case where information is rather poor. Say if it's quite unclear what the demand for this new firm's product would be. A related idea, somewhat different idea though, is the idea of what is sometimes called the experience curve. Now this is quite different from economies of scale, because this is a story that says that average costs may fall over time as a firm has experience in producing its product. So the way that this is illustrated, just in terms of a downward sloping average cost of production, looks the same as the case of economies of scale, but what is on the horizontal axis is quite different. In the economies of scale case, we were looking at something like production per year. Here, we're thinking about how much of this product has the firm ever produced. So this is the total amount that it's produced from the beginning of time, what we're calling cumulative production up to the present time. So the more experience the firm has, this is saying it essentially learns how to produce more cheaply. And perhaps at some point that additional experience becomes less and less important. So I've also here drawn a case where after a certain amount of experience, that decline in average cost essentially stops happening. Well, new entrants don't have the same advantage, of course, because they don't have the experience. By the way, you might be connecting this with the term learning curve, which you might have seen in the past. The two ideas are quite close, I think. I think of the learning curve as describing a situation where, say, workers on an assembly line are doing the same task over and over, and they learn how to do that task a little more quickly or a little more efficiently in some way. I think this idea of an experience curve is a little broader than that, although it certainly includes that kind of learning activity. Another set of ideas that describes a barrier to entry is the idea that a commodity supply could be controlled by an industry. So if, for example, a commodity was used as a key input in the industry, if a new entrant didn't have access to that key input, it wouldn't be able to produce its product. So if a firm controlled a key input like that, that would give it effective control over the industry. It would really prevent any competition from entering. Well, it's a case that's discussed in your text, but it's hard to think of any real situation in which this is the case. So I'm not really going to think about it too much. Another situation which I think is more realistic, and one that we'll think about again a little bit later in the course, is the idea of a cartel, where firms are coordinating their actions for mutual profit, that is, to raise the profits of each individual firm and therefore all of the firms collectively. So this would be a situation in which the supply of everyone's product could be, for example, restricted to try to keep prices high in the market as a whole. Kind of the flip side of limiting output to keep prices high is simply making agreements to fix prices. So if prices are kept high, then of course consumer demand is going to be relatively low and firms won't have to produce as much. So the idea of a cartel is that the firms essentially divide the market up among themselves and increase their profits. Perhaps each firm would have a particular geographic region to itself, or perhaps they would share the market in some other way. You often hear the term cartel used in describing, say, drug cartels and other kinds of organized crime. Cartels are illegal in Canada and many other countries, but businesses still try to fix prices. So we will see some examples later in the course. I might just add that while cartels are illegal in individual countries, there is no real international law here. So it's possible that, for example, the governments of countries could get together to restrict the supply of a particular commodity to try to drive up its price. So the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, did that for oil initially in the 1970s. There have been attempts to create cartels in production and sale of coffee as well. So to the extent that cartels are able to keep profits high, that, of course, is going to attract entrants to the industry, if that's possible, And so cartels are really going to rely on other kinds of barriers to entry in order to exist. In the case of organized crime, of course, you would simply kill the competition. In the case of oil or coffee, the examples I gave a moment ago, you might not be able to limit the entry of potential competitors. Well, finally, we could have legal or regulatory barriers to entry that are discussed in your text. A typical example is intellectual property, patents and copyright, for example. So if firms own this kind of intellectual property, other firms can't use that property without their permission, without making a payment, for example. So if a drug company owns a patent on a particular pharmaceutical drug, another company could only produce that if it paid the company that had a patent, if it had a license to produce it. Copyright applies to creative works like books, software, music, and so on. Now, there is a purpose to having this kind of barrier to entry and restriction of competition. The rationale is to encourage innovation and to allow the costs of research and development to be recovered in the form of higher prices, at least temporarily, while that intellectual property is granted. Patents and copyrights, of course, have a limited time period, so they expire after a certain point. Your text discusses licensing as a barrier to entry, but we have to be careful here. Licensing is not a barrier to entry if the number of licenses that's issued is not restricted. Now, in many cases it is. Let's say if you look at a particular city, the number of taxi licenses is likely restricted to a certain number. So it doesn't mean that anybody who wants to drive a taxi can just pay a fee and get a license. There might be a limited number. If the number of licenses is not restricted, then it's just a cost of doing business. You've got to buy a license. You've got to do the training to get a license, and anybody can do that. The same goes for government regulations that are also discussed in your reading. These kinds of regulations exist for good reason. There's regulations dealing with health and safety, with the way that buildings are constructed, for example. And so the cost of meeting those regulations is just another cost of doing business. And in and of themselves, they're not a barrier to entry. Of course, they do raise the cost of production, so if that involves some increase in fixed costs, perhaps as we saw there earlier, that might involve some initial upfront investment, and so financing for that would have to be obtained. But in and of itself, as I say, I don't think licensing or regulations of this kind are really a significant barrier. Well, let's turn to see what kinds of strategies firms might adopt in order to raise barriers to entry.